Hello, everybody. It's Ed Rosenberg, and this afternoon I am speaking to James Thompson from Prosper. James, how you doing?
Thanks for having me on, Ed. It's good to be back.
Okay, it's a pleasure. And Prosper's still a long time. I think it's May 13 and 14, right?
Next year, May 13, 14, Las Vegas. Yep, that's where we'll be.
Okay, so we still got a long time for that. But we're going to talk about something which I've seen a lot about, like in passing. I haven't really focused enough that I can answer questions about it. But I know a lot of people are talking about something called sales tax amnesty from a certain amount of states. And were you directly involved? Did I read that right? You were directly involved in negotiating this?
So the short answer is I wasn't negotiating, but I was pushing to make it happen. So uh, unfortunately, sales tax is a huge issue for Amazon sellers, specifically FBA sellers. And in fact, we did some analysis and discovered that there are about $5 billion a year of unpaid sales tax coming just from FBA sellers in the U.S. So let me step back and say, when a seller chooses to use Amazon's FBA program, their inventory gets shipped to a number of Amazon fulfillment centers, and then Amazon moves that inventory around to other states. And the law basically states that when your inventory is sitting in a particular state for a number of states, that will trigger what's called sales tax nexus, meaning you have responsibility to collect sales tax on all of the orders that subsequently you ship into that state. So for example, if you are not physically located in New Jersey, but your inventory goes into a Amazon fulfillment center in New Jersey, you are now responsible for collecting sales tax on all of the orders that your company ships into the state of New Jersey, regardless of whether it's the same inventory or not. The fact is you now have what's called sales tax nexus in that state. Well, it turns out that when you're a seller of any decent size using FBA and you've been doing it for a couple of years, your inventory is being moved around by Amazon to as many as 24, 25 different states. At least 22 of those states have laws that state that if you have inventory in that state, such as sitting in an Amazon FBA facility, you have sales tax responsibility. It turns out that very, very few Amazon sellers actually pay the sales tax properly. And what that means is they are accruing sales tax liability over time. Some of my colleagues who are brokers who help sell Amazon accounts have told me that for a number of companies that have approached them about selling their companies, it's only at that time that they come to realize that in fact they have this huge liability of unpaid sales tax that they are responsible for paying. Something really scary has started happening in the last 18 months. A number of the states have gotten very aggressive at finding Amazon sellers and starting to audit them. And we've seen the state of California, Washington State, the state of Connecticut compile lists of large Amazon sellers, figure out who they are, and start going after them for sales tax. And if you've been an FBA seller for 3-4 years and you're doing some very decent volume, basically look at your sales volume, take at least 5, maybe 6% of your revenue. That's unpaid sales tax. And if you've done that 6 or 7% for 3, 4, 5 years, you could owe far more money than you're going to make in margin this year just in tax liability. I'm not here to scare anybody. I don't want to scare anybody here. But the reality is there's a liability that's being built up, and we'll talk here in a minute about what we're doing to try to address it.
Right, a couple of things in my mind, and I know I'm wrong, but in my mind, like, can't I make the argument and say that I sent it to Amazon and knock yourself out? I mean, if I send something to UPS sometimes also warehouses my shipments like overnight in a certain state. So I'm giving it to Amazon, the boogeyman, and knock yourself out. Why is it my responsibility where Amazon stores it?
Amazon is basically a 3PL for you. And when you ship inventory to them, they store it for you, awaiting information around an upcoming sale. So although Amazon doesn't do a very good job of telling you where they've moved the product, yes, you can pull a report out of Seller Central that tells you today where your FBA inventory is sitting. The inventory actually gets moved around. And it turns out you're responsible for knowing where it's been and where you have sales tax responsibility. If you look in the Amazon seller contract, there's two very important things that are stated there. Number one, there is no consignment model here. Amazon is holding the inventory on your behalf. It's your inventory. It's your sales tax responsibility. The second thing that's in the contract, it says all sales tax responsibility is the seller's responsibility. So even if Amazon is holding the inventory and you think, well, they're the ones making the decisions where the inventory gets placed, that's all very nice and well, but the responsibility is still all on the seller. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, for better or for worse, when you use FBA, this is one of the downsides of using FBA that most sellers never think about, or they don't realize how quickly the problem becomes a big problem. I have a colleague who just finished paying over $1 million in fines to one state that got him because of FBA sales tax nexus. He's based in one state. His inventory got placed in another state. He sells a lot of volume. Those sales over several years accrued, and the tax liability for that particular state got to be bigger and bigger and bigger. You add on interest, you add on penalties, and all of a sudden he's paying over $1 million in penalties.
He couldn't
and that's
fight
one
it?
state. That's one state.
And he couldn't fight it somehow?
The fighting comes down to basically negotiating what exactly he's going to owe. Maybe he fights, I don't want to pay penalties, I don't want to pay interest because I didn't know this was an issue, but you still owe the underlying liability. And by the way, if a state fines you, some states have no limit to how far back they can go. So if you've been an FBA seller for 5, 6, 7 years and your inventory has definitely been in that state at some point, they can go all the way back to when it first hit that state. So if I've been a large seller, for example, the biggest state in the country is California. If I've been a big FBA seller and at some point my inventory went into California, from the moment my inventory ended up being stored in California, even if it's for a day, from that point forward, the state of California can come after me for sales tax liability. And let's make things worse. If you're an Amazon seller and you sell on other marketplaces, you sell on your own website, and you're all the same legal structure, that tax nexus carries over to all those other parts of your business. So it's not just the Amazon portion that you're going to owe sales tax on, it's all the other stuff.
Wow. And they actually, how do they work? I'm sorry, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, please Ed, please.
How do they work? Like, the state of California could come knocking on my door if I live in New York?
Yeah, so let's talk about what's actually happening. I live in Seattle. The state of Washington is probably the most aggressive state right now at identifying and targeting large Amazon sellers to audit them. What happens is you wake up one morning and there's a letter in your mailbox that says, we know who you are, Ed Rosenberg. We've sent this to your business address, and we are investigating you because we believe you haven't been collecting or paying sales tax. The state doesn't care if you haven't collected it. They want to know, have you paid the sales tax? And it turns out if a state can find that you've sold at least $1 of product where you have sales tax nexus in their state, you now have to basically get an accountant and a lawyer and everything involved to do a comprehensive audit. Mm-hmm. So the moment the state finds you and gets to you first, it's game over because they're going to audit you and they're going to decide what you owe. So the argument can't be, oh, I haven't sold that much. The argument is if you've sold at least $1 and you haven't paid the tax, then you're guilty. And so now the discussion becomes around what are you going to be able to pay? You can't bankrupt your business out of tax liability. If you get audited and you owe $100,000 to a state and you don't have $100,000, the state will work with you to figure out a payment structure, a payment plan. But you can't bankrupt yourself and say, oh, well, that's fine, I'll just start all over. No, because in fact, the liability carries over to the owner of the LLC. So if the state were so obliged, they could put a lien on your house. They could do all sorts of crazy stuff. Not a pleasant situation. So let's fast forward. Really scary situation. Sellers are accruing tax liability without knowing that there's a big issue here. We brought out, at the last Prosper show, we brought out a gentleman called Richard Cram, who's the director of an organization called the Multi-State Tax Commission. It's an organization that works with 37 different departments of revenue. These are the state groups that oversee the auditing and the tax collection for different states. We brought Richard out. He got to present to 1,000+ large Amazon sellers, and he very quickly realized that if I'm a seller who has a tax liability and I don't know what to do with it, the process of trying to make good and fix the problem could cost me so much money that I can't afford to stay in business. So if you want to do the right thing, but you have accrued all this tax liability, how do you make things work? You're stuck between continuing not to collect or continuing not to pay sales tax because you're hoping you won't get audited, with the likelihood that at some point you will get audited because you're big enough that somebody will eventually find you, and it'll cost you so much money that you're in big trouble. So we the folks at Prosper, we asked Richard to go to all of his states, all of his 37 member states, and see if they could put together what's called an amnesty program. And the bottom line is he delivered, and he came back with an amnesty program where we now have 24 different states in the country who have agreed between August 17th and October 17th to waive, in most cases, to waive all back taxes. As long as you come forward as a seller and say, okay, my name is Ed Rosenberg, I'm a seller, I've never been collecting in the state of California, but I'm sorry, I shouldn't use California because California, unfortunately, is not part of this amnesty program. But let's say, for example, I'm in the state of Florida. Florida is one of the states involved in this amnesty program. I'm Ed Rosenberg. I've been an Amazon seller. I haven't been collecting Florida state tax. I have accrued a bunch of sales tax liability that I haven't paid. But let's just do the following. Because I haven't paid in your state, and you don't know who I am, from this point forward, I'm going to identify myself, and I'm going to start collecting tax in the state of Florida. And the state of Florida will forgive me on all the back taxes that, in fact, I've accrued up to this point. So with this amnesty program, there's 24 states, including DC, involved. For 22 of those regions, there's a no look back program, meaning during this amnesty program, 22 different states, you can sign up, identify yourself as a seller. They will forgive all the back taxes that you've collected or that you've accrued over time. And from this point going forward, as long as you register in the state and start collecting sales tax in the state, then you'll be good. You won't have to worry about all that liability. They can't audit you on what's happened in the past. As long as you provide correct information and you're not giving the wrong information when you register, then you're good to go. I had a seller who came to Prosper who sent me a note and said that as a result of this, she immediately can write off over $75,000 of liability that she didn't really understand that she had. But when she started to look at the numbers, she realized that FBA had moved her inventory around, and she actually had over $75,000 of tax liability. So I've shared with you a link for this organization, the Multi-State Tax Commission, mtc.gov. There's a link that I've shared with you that has a landing page with the whole program in place. It's got the application form where you indicate who you are, which particular states you want to get registered for, and you want to get your back taxes waived. And then from this point going forward, you're now going to collect the taxes and you're now going to pay the taxes. As I'm sure most of your audience knows, Amazon will collect the sales tax if you ask them to, and you give them the sales tax ID numbers for the various states in which you want to collect. So through this program, if you register, for example, in the state of Florida, you get a Florida tax ID, you put it in your Seller Central account, and from this point going forward, Amazon will collect the Florida state tax for you. You're responsible for making sure you pay it, but at least it's now being collected at the correct rate automatically for you, and you can now sleep much better at night knowing that, for example, with the state of Florida, they're not going to come and audit you for a bunch of back taxes you didn't realize you had as a result of using FBA. So I want to be aware of the fact that most of these states are also offering an amnesty program on income tax that may not have been paid as a result of selling certain minimum volumes in each of these states. So it's not just sales and use tax, it's also income tax for most states. Now, the reason I'm having to hedge my wording here is not all states are giving exactly the same terms on this amnesty program. So it's important for people to look at the mtc.gov site to see the very specific rules and regulations for each state.
Why would I have to pay income tax in California?
Yep. So if you sell over a certain amount of product into the state and you have nexus in the state as a result of using, for example, FBA, you are now responsible for income tax. You're responsible for filing income tax in that state. You have to hit a minimum threshold, and the thresholds are different for every state. I didn't say this was easy. I didn't say it was obvious. It is confusing because it's different by state. But you will now be responsible for paying income tax in certain states if you sell over a certain volume. So if you're based in New York State and you're having to pay income tax in California on the product you sell in California, you wouldn't also be paying income tax on the same product sales in New York. You would simply now have multiple different income taxes in different states. Think of it like an athlete that plays sports in all sorts of different states. They have to pay state tax and state income tax in every one of those states because they happen to have had revenue coming in from each of those states.
It's interesting.
I'm not a tax advisor. This gets really confusing really quickly. My number one advice is go talk to your CPA. If your CPA does not have sales tax nexus experience, get somebody who does. And the good news is, if you look at any of these, the four major tax remittance companies that help online sellers, companies like Avalara, Taxify, TaxJar, Vertex, all of these companies can point you to the right kinds of consultants and advisors and lawyers and accountants that will advise you on sales tax nexus. The bottom line is, an amnesty program is a very, very rare event. So if someone is listening to today's discussion and they're thinking, I've been doing FBA, I haven't been paying sales tax in all these states, maybe I should look into this. You have until October 17th to file that paperwork. Until October 17th to be in a position that you can have all of that back tax liability removed. So I would very much encourage anyone to start by looking at the mtc.gov site, to look at the forms that need to be filled out. They are confusing forms. That's why you're going to probably need to get a tax advisor or your CPA or someone to help you understand what this all means for your business. Realistically, if you do over $500,000 in sales on Amazon and you've been doing that level for at least 3, maybe 4 years, this is an issue you need to take very seriously, because the amount of liability that you will have accrued after doing FBA at that volume for 3 or 4 years, you're going to owe hundreds of thousands of dollars. And when an individual state comes after you and fines you and audits you and gives you a penalty for not paying all these back taxes, your cash flow is going to be absolutely devastated. I mean, you're going to be in a really, really bad situation.
Wow.
The state of Connecticut, I just learned the state of Connecticut, I don't know how they got this. The state of Connecticut just got their hands on information for the top 500 FBA sellers on Amazon. We know the state of Washington is doing a really good job finding large sellers. The state of New York subpoenaed data from Amazon on sellers. As some of these states get very, very good at subpoenaing data and getting access to the identities of sellers, they're going to come after sellers. So whether you participate in this amnesty program to help shave off some of the liability for certain states that participate, there's still all the other states that aren't participating in the amnesty program. Big states like New York and California. New York doesn't have Amazon FBA facilities yet. California absolutely does. So if you're a large FBA seller and you're not paying sales tax in the state of California, you need to talk to a tax advisor, because you've got a problem on your hands. You got a big problem. If you're not paying in the state of Washington, you also have a big problem. It's not as big a state, but it's a very, very aggressive group of auditors coming after Amazon sellers. So this is one of those tidal waves that people don't see coming, and not a lot of people are talking about this because this is not sexy stuff that helps grow your business. This is a huge liability that unfortunately a lot of sellers are not aware they have. Please understand, I am not here to be a fearmonger. I'm here to raise awareness that there are a lot of Amazon sellers who do not realize they have a large liability that they need to address. I have no financial interest in revealing this to anybody. No. I don't work with any tax companies. I just want sellers to be aware that they can sleep well at night knowing that tomorrow they're not going to get a letter in the mail from one of these aggressive states saying, you owe us $100,000 for something you didn't realize that you've been doing through FBA.
And you've actually seen this happen. I mean, you said it before.
Oh, I have people who are part of your audience who have reached out to me and asked questions. I have other large sellers who have reached out to me and told me about their audit nightmares. I mean, they are literally waking up one day getting a letter in the mail from some state that they didn't realize had them on their radar. We are auditing you. We understand that you've been selling on Amazon. There are public websites that will help these auditors figure out who are the biggest FBA sellers out there. If I'm one of those auditors, I start at that list and I say, all right, who's XYZ company? Who's deals? Who's Best Buys deals? I mean, all the companies are listed there. Now I just got to figure out who are these people, where are they based, and I start sending letters. And the ROI to increase my audit team to go after Amazon sellers, the ROI is really, really good. So states are going to get really sophisticated coming after some of these sellers. Just to give you a sense, the average state budget, a third of it comes from sales tax revenue. There's over $5 billion of uncollected, unpaid sales tax right now just from Amazon sellers each year. If I take $5 billion, let's say 10% of the population of this country is in the state of New York, and there's $5 billion. That means there's $500 million of revenue that's not coming into the state of New York. How many auditors do you think it's worth the state of New York hiring to go after $500 million?
Right. Right.
So
and with technology, it's, they can find everything out pretty quickly.
Yep.
Now, are you familiar with the Marketplace Fairness Act?
I'm sorry, with the what?
The MFA, Marketplace Fairness Act.
I am aware of it. The issue as to whether it's onerous for a seller to be collecting sales tax, that has been challenged multiple times, and multiple states have basically said the tools are available for you as an online seller to be collecting the tax. You're responsible for collecting the tax. Unfortunately, Amazon will collect the tax for you. Unfortunately, there are tax companies that will calculate the sales tax you owe. So as a seller, the tools are there and they're affordable. So even if you want to be able to say as a seller, I can't keep track of 13,000 tax jurisdictions and what the rates are, the good news is there's software that does that for you very efficiently. So as much as I would like to be able to help sellers back out of the responsibility of paying their sales tax, the reality is it needs to be addressed by every seller. Every seller needs to ask the question, how much risk am I willing to take on in uncollected, unpaid sales tax? I may get audited from a little state and owe a little bit of money. I may get audited by a big state and owe a lot of money. We don't make huge margins as sellers on Amazon. It's not like we make 90% margins and we can afford to pay whatever unexpected penalty comes along. If I make 15% margin as a seller, but 5% of the 15, so 1/3 of all of my profit is actually unpaid sales tax liability, 1/3 of my profit is actually liability that I'm not addressing. If I sell for 3 years, I actually have as much liability as I have profit. I'm worth nothing. 3 years as a seller not paying sales tax, I have no assets. I'm not worth anything just because of my liability.
Right, and this is actually more than just an amnesty, because normally amnesty is, you fess up and you pay what you owe without any fines.
Yep.
But you're saying
this is what's called a no look back, meaning as of this date, we forgive everything that's happened up to this point. You may have been a seller for 1 month. You may have been a seller for 5 years. We're not going to worry about that as long as from this point forward, you identify who you are and you start collecting and paying sales tax. So this amnesty program is a very, very unusual situation. We've never had a multi-state tax amnesty like this specifically designed for online sellers. So anybody who's listening today, it's your audience, who is selling on Amazon, who's doing at least $500,000 a year and has been doing FBA for at least a year, they need to ask themselves the question, how much liability do you want to accrue, or do you just want to get rid of it by participating in the amnesty program?
Right. Why'd you pick that number, $500,000 a year?
I take $500,000 a year. Let's say I do $500,000 a year. I'm making 15% margin. So, I make, 75, 80 grand a year in profit. That's not a lot of money, but if all of a sudden, $25,000 a year is actually accruing as tax liability, if I can afford, for $25,000 a year, that's a big chunk of money. So to me, it's a big chunk of money, $25,000. And so I take $500,000 and I say, by the time you sell $500,000 a year, you have $25,000 of unpaid tax liability. Maybe somebody can absorb $25,000 in penalties, no problem. For me, I look at that and I say that's a big enough number that I start to worry. If somebody says I can't afford to pay $10,000 or address $10,000 of liability, then maybe your number is much smaller. Maybe you sell $200,000 a year in product. The bottom line is people need to look at this seriously and ask themselves the question, how much liability am I willing to take on? How much risk am I willing to take on in not addressing my sales tax responsibilities?
Right, but the $25,000, that's only if all the states come after you at the same time.
This is true, but I didn't factor in any penalties. I didn't factor in any interest. I certainly didn't factor in the ridiculous amounts of time that you as a business owner are going to spend getting paperwork together, paying your CPA, dealing with all the nonsense that goes with being audited. So here we are about to get into Q4. You've got an opportunity in the next basically 60 days to get this addressed. Of the 24 states participating, I think 9 of them are states that have FBA facilities right now. So at a minimum, you've got 9 states where you can get all the FBA liability waived if you come forward. So why not start with 9? Obviously, we'd love to have New York and California in the program, which they are unfortunately not. But you got to start somewhere. This is essentially a free gift to sellers to start to address some of the liability that they actually have accrued. I don't want sellers to say, well, I'm not going to participate until all the big states participate in an amnesty program. The reality is states like California, Washington, New York, they're not participating in amnesty programs because they already have viciously aggressive auditing teams that are going after Amazon sellers. They don't need or don't want to participate in an amnesty program because they feel they already have a plan in place to identify and pursue the unpaid liability that FBA sellers have in those states.
Right. I mean, New York's a little different because New York, you said there's no FBA facility. They're just going after people who actually live in New York.
Yeah, and unfortunately, one of the things that we have seen is there are a lot of Amazon sellers that don't even collect sales tax in their own state.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So
yeah.
they may be paying the sales tax, but they're paying it out of pocket. The thing is, if they give Amazon the responsibility to collect the sales tax for them, that tax simply gets added after the product's been put in the buy box, or sorry, put in the cart by the customer. So it's a pass-through expense. Why absorb it? If you are not collecting sales tax in your own home state, quite frankly, that's mind-bogglingly stupid. And I'll say that on record. It's insane to not be collecting and paying sales tax in your own home state. But for all those other states where your FBA inventory might be sitting, you probably have tax liability you need to address. And so this is a really, really good time in this short 2-month window for sellers to do something about it. So please post the link that I've provided you to share with your audience. This is real, and people need to think about how much risk they're willing to take on. If they've been successful sellers, the more successful you are, the more likely that states know who you are and they're just waiting to get to you so they can audit you. And the larger you are, the more tax liability you most likely have accumulated. Why not get a bunch of it removed by participating in the amnesty program?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. So thank you, James, for coming on and explaining it very clearly. Now it's actually a little different than I thought, so you did a great job explaining it.
Okay. Thanks for having me on today, Ed.
You got it. Thank you so much, as always, James. Be well.
Take care.
Bye.